think about when Japan is contacted by Western society. And so, as I mentioned before, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa Shogunate from about 1604 to about 1867, so about 250 years, give or take. And so the question is, what is this Tokugawa Shogunate? What was the overall view of Japan? What kind of things were going on? And so again, if you're following, this would be slide 69. And so and even before we talk about 1604 or 1850, we need to go back to 1183. So traditionally in Japan, the emperor was the top figure in the empire. But that was until 1183. So in 1183, the shogun became, there was sort of this flip. And so the shogun became sort of the top leader in Japan, even though the shogun was basically the military leader. So it's not like power officially changed, but the military leader was the shogun. And so this would be the state of affairs from about 1183 to 1867, when there was another flip and the emperor became the ultimate authority. And so, but without even going into all those hundreds of years in between, we want to mention that even the shogunates, so the shogun, remember the top military leader, and so he would rule over what was called the shogunate. So the Tokugawa shogunate was the sort of last, and so they would have this succession of leaders. And so it was sort of the last shogunate to be in power before the restoration of the emperor. And so the Tokugawa shogunate from about 1604 decides that they are not going to have anything with Westerners, outsiders, Christians. Like if you're Japanese, you stay in Japan, you do not travel abroad, you do not, they literally did what the United States cannot do. They actually collected all the guns in Japan and destroyed them. Just left a few in the now of course this also saw the restoration of the samurais as the warriors, and of course samurais don't necessarily use guns, and so between 1604 and 1853 Japan was secluded. Like, you didn't leave, you didn't come in, they didn't want foreigners, they didn't want anything to do with trade. So it was a period of seclusion. In fact, some people call this the Tokugawa seclusion. There were attempts to interact with Japan, but there were very few. In part because Japan was seeing what was happening to China, and they thought they really didn't want that to happen. But so we do see these attempts, including by the United States. We see that inevitably trade such as opium and other kinds of goods were going through the Pacific Northwest near Japan, and so there were questions of whether Japan would eventually be open to Western encroachment. So especially after 1840, after 1842, when Japan saw what happened with the opium wars and how China was underprepared to confront the West, there was an even greater discussion about should they interact with the West based on equality or wait until they are humiliated like the Chinese. And so when we begin to think about the first Western contact sounds. There was contact, of course, but maybe substantive contact between the Japanese and the Westerners. There was questions of how to address this. So the Mito School of Foreign Policy suggested that maybe there should be some engagement. The Mito School advocated military response, so did the samurais, but there were still voices in the empire that said maybe we should not, maybe we should open up to them, and you'll actually see how Japan acts differently. So in July 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrives with a fleet of very powerful ships. And so he makes, according to the Japanese, he makes demands. According to Matthew Perry, he opened the door to friendship. So really kind of depends on which side you take. I guess we take the American side. But he had a multiracial crew. He had a lot of newer technologies like the telegraph, miniature trains, and so it sort of leaves. So he also does a very clever thing. He tells the Japanese he's proposing friendship, and he's coming friendship through a treaty, and he's coming to collect his response a year later. So the Japanese had a year to think about this. Now, so there was, of course, a lot of discussion within the empire whether they should sign the treaty or they should not. It is also said that when he arrived in Japan, so he arrives like on July 1st or 2nd, around there. Now, 4th of July is Independence Day, and so apparently he put on a show, fireworks and everything. But apparently he was just intimidating the Japanese, so they might think positively about his overtures. And so he comes back a year later, and the Treaty of Kanagawa is signed. Treaty of Kanagawa. It had a whole bunch of requests, some of which the Japanese found very objectionable, including, for example, having ambassadors, American ambassadors, live in Japan. And Japan was like, we don't like foreigners over here, so maybe we should not allow you to. But the Japanese were suitably impressed, particularly by the ships, and they kind of knew they didn't have anything that could match the Americans. So what do? Now, of course, this is the period of not just the sailing ships, as we saw with China. The HMS Nemesis was a paddle steamer, so it was a steamship. It could sail, it could make steam, and so Matthew Perry comes with similar ships, and you can probably see some of those on his ships on slide 74. So he had 4 warships. I think his flagship was the Powhatan, maybe. And so there's actually a flag on there which we had projections, so you can see it. And so when he arrives in Japan, the U.S. has 31 states. The 31st state was California, which joined the Union in 1850. And so 50 states, or rather 30 states, 31 states, not 50. So the flag that he carried would have a very historic future use. And so when Perry comes back in, he gives the Japanese quite a number of things, including some old guns. Remember, the Japanese had gotten rid of all their guns, and they had decided to live in a gun-free society. But this wasn't good for when you now have a powerful naval force. And so the question was, what does Japanese do from now on? Now, 77 has the summary of the Treaty of Kanagawa, and you can sort of see some of the same things, like mutual peace between the US and the Empire of Japan, opening of the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate. So again, opening of ports to foreign shipping. Some of that other stuff makes sense, like assistance to be provided to shipwrecked American sailors, not to be imprisoned or mistreated. Now, this one the Japanese objected to: freedom of movement for temporary foreign residents, freedom of movement, trade transactions to be permitted, forex, foreign exchange, provisioning of US ships to be a Japanese government monopoly. So the Japanese government to give American ships what they need, and so 11 was actually probably the most troublesome for the Japanese, the opening of an American consulate at Shimoda. Now, but the Japanese were very clever about this. Like, while they agreed to the opening of a consulate, they kind of placed it in the farthest possible place away from Tokyo. So it's sort of like, okay, but also the Japanese called Westerners barbarians. Actually, the Japanese called American sailors blue-eyed barbarians. This would be not very. The Americans wouldn't feel very good about this, and in future they would recommend that they don't be called barbarians. So the Treaty of Kanagawa is signed. And Japan now begins to sort of modify itself. But we need to say that the treaty signed in 1854. There are these discussions, but there's also the War of Restoration. So Japan goes through a civil war between about 1864 to 1868, which results in the emperor being restored, because the samurais were like, no, we are going to fight these Americans to the death. But there's consensus that maybe Japan is not going to win, even though that was not what they did in 1941. Speaking of 1941, this slide on there with I'm not sure if you recognize that as General Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur, who apparently rescued the Philippines, was a cousin of Commodore Matthew Perry. So it's kind of a family affair. They had a lot of interactions with Japan. But and we'll talk about the Second World War, the Japanese surrender, but actually that image is of the Japanese surrender in September 1945. And so the flag that Commodore Perry carried the first time to Japan with 31 stars, which had been put in a museum in, I think it might have been in DC, was flown to Japan so that it could be displayed when the Japanese surrendered. Now, I don't think it's a good thing to humiliate people like that, but you can begin to see these kinds of connections. Now, as I mentioned, the Japanese generally refer to Westerners as blue-eyed barbarians, and generally in their literature painted those blue-eyed barbarians in very interesting ways, clowns. So they were not necessarily happy about. So, again, when you think about China, Japan, their histories, their humiliations, their whole existence, again, these are countries that have existed, or societies that have existed for thousands of years. And some of these things are not easily forgotten. So when you sort of think about the Second World War, is there something there that goes back to 1853 and the Treaty of Kanagawa and being sort of forced to agree to this treaty? Now, the Japanese did realize that these so-called blue-eyed barbarians had superior technologies. So, for example, Morse code, as I mentioned, a quarter-size steam train carriages with a track. Sailors wearing blackface, although that is not necessarily flattering. I think we have some understanding of blackface and how it has been racialized in this country. But so there's these ongoing discussions. The U.S. does send its first consul. So consul is like an ambassador, but in a smaller. It's not a fully fledged embassy. But in this context, we can think of Townsend Harris as the first American diplomat to Japan. In 1750, they agreed to exchange diplomatic representatives, to accept low tariffs of on imported goods, allow foreign residents and visitors, extraterritoriality. I don't know if we mentioned what extraterritoriality is. Oh, that's a extraterritoriality is like diplomatic immunity. So again, you're seeing the same unequal treaties sort of being imposed. Well, not imposed because the Japanese signed it, but I don't know if someone has, if someone is choking the life out of you, can you really say no? And so it's almost like the same unequal treaty that China was subjected. So the Treaty of Nanking, Treaty of Tianjin, the Boxer Protocols, um, except the Japanese actually consent to this. Perhaps they didn't have a. But again, this treaty is extended to all the other European countries, the Netherlands, the UK, France, Russia. So really, it's. But there was also great alarm that there was now a barbarian living on Japanese soil, and the samurais were not taking this very well. And so, if you actually look at those slides, you'll see sort of where Edo was and where Shimoda was. So it's sort of like now Japan has 4 islands, so sometimes it's also a little distance. But so there were these. The Japanese were not very happy about this. The samurais, especially, were not very happy about this. Now, I briefly mentioned, so over between 1854 and about 1864, when these discussions are going on, the emperor dies, and there's a new emperor who is installed. His name was Mutsuhito. He was actually about 15. Now, his official name was the Meiji Emperor. So you didn't refer to him by his name. You generally refer to the Meiji Emperor, and so he was 15, so a teenager. But he's now the emperor, and of course, as we mentioned, sometimes this rule was carried out by the regents. And so the issue that Mutsuhito faced, or at least that Japan faced, is the question of how to come into modernity. Remember, for example, the military is the samurai. They don't use weapons. But also the organization of Japan was a little feudal. So you had this like feudal lord, and people lived on his farm, including the samurais who were serving other roles in peacetime, like they were schoolmasters and people who sort of like government agents. They also kept the census, those kinds of things. Now, Mutsuhito is shown as being eventually one of the figures to adopt Western mannerisms, definitely especially dress. The Japanese would actually go on to do other things like recommend changes even in diet, so that they ate more meat and those kinds of things. But so we see Mutsuhito. We also see the so when the Tokugawa Shogunate falls at the end of the Civil War in 1968, we see what is called the Meiji Restoration. So this is the restoration of the empire to be the top figure in Japan. And so if you study Japanese history, you'll see a lot of maybe references to the Meiji Restoration. And so this is where Mutsuhito, the emperor, is now again making all the decisions. I say making all the decisions, even though eventually there would be a parliament, there would be a cabinet, and so today Japan, and this constitution goes back to about 1945 after the US conquered Japan. So today the Japanese emperor is a figurehead, although he's almost godlike. But he's not the one who makes day-to-day decisions. That would be the prime minister. And so this would be part of the modifications that the Japanese do after 1868. So when we think about the changes or the discussions, so there were emphasis on change, but there were also those who did not want to change, particularly the samurai. And the samurai actually starts, they are anti-Western. They start killing Westerners. They start killing Christians, and assassinated Tokugawa officials because they're like, you signed the treaty of, Kanagawa, and now you sold us out. And in fact, Japan is becoming a second-rate copy of Western nations, and we are losing Confucianism. And so this wasn't very good for Japan. So the War of Restoration. The Tokugawa Shogunate capitulates in 1867. Meiji is restored in 1868. And so the question is, what kind of constitution will Japan have? And this constitution initially begins, so they are marching towards a parliamentary constitutional democracy, but the Japanese actually borrow their constitution from many places. The Germans, the US, so something like 2 houses of parliament. But also remember, they are a constitutional democracy at that point. And so, but still, the question is, what do you do with the samurai? Where do they go? Now, what the Japanese government did, they are actually dismantling the whole of traditional Japanese society. So they are taking out, so again, remember I mentioned that the feudal system, so the feudal domain was called the Han. So everybody belonged to their Han. And so the Japanese take this apart and they replace it with prefectures, which are like provinces or what you might think of as states. Then they recruit a modern army. They disband the samurai. The samurai are given some money, go start a business, and so on. Now, this is not going to be, the samurai are not, well, most of them go quietly. Some will stoke another rebellion in 1874. But the Japanese do make these modifications and they adopt the policy of Western science for the essence, or rather Western science and Eastern ethics. So Western science for technology, Eastern ethics as the guiding compass of individuals, I guess, internally. So 1853, Matthew Perry comes. 1867, War of Restoration begins. Restoration happens in 1868. 1874, Japan invades Korea. And so you can sort of see how quickly Japan changes itself. 1895, so about 40 years after Matthew Perry, Japan defeats China in the Sino-Japanese War. 1905, it fights Russia and wins. So Japan has really modified itself very quickly. Of course, it's a very small country, so it makes sense that Japan would modernize quickly, and China, for example, would not. But so they purchase other things like Ryukyu Islands, they control Formosa, which is Taiwan. But as we mentioned, even internally, there's still challenges with the samurai. So for example, Saigo Takamori leads a dissident samurai revolt. And so this is the dissident samurais are still like, we're modernizing too fast. We're becoming Western too much, and we're losing the Japanese essence. And so Saigo Takamori, with a bunch of his samurai, begin a revolt, which doesn't really go very well. So in 1877, he actually commits harakiri, which is ritual suicide, which is terrible, but it involves disemboweling oneself. Yeah, it's terrible. We should probably not talk about it. But so the ultimate outcome is that when the Westerners have this substantive engagement with Japan, this ends a 250-year monopoly over foreign policy. There are questions of what Japan should do, adopt modernity or not, whether people should debate issues like whether you should have political debate. And so the consensus is that yes, maybe people should have should have these discussions. So some do support self-strengthening, so as not to be like China, and one of them is Yokoi Shonan, and unfortunately he advocated for trade, and which he thought would bring in riches, but then he's assassinated by anti-foreign assassins, so people who do not want Japan to be Western. So some of those who are opposed to increasing contact with Western countries thought that, and they had some significant arguments. So for example, they say trade would weaken Japan. I think most people say trade makes everyone better. They thought that Japan would get opium and be like China. They thought that Japan would be infected with Christianity, so the Confucian ethics. And so the Japanese had actually seen their share of Christianity in the 1600s, but those who converted to Christianity were actually, when Christianity was banned, they were crucified upside down. Some of them were thrown into Mount Fuji, which is volcanic. So Japan wasn't trying to, no, like they'd been like, we are not. So again, 250 years later, they are having this discussion of, are we going to be infected by Christianity? And again, you will probably hear of references to Bushido, which is kind of the warrior spirit. And so this is what the those opposed to external interventions and contacts are arguing about, or they are arguing for, like they should revive the Japanese spirit. They also talked about Sonojoy, revere the monarch, expel the barbarian. So you see these debates going on. But again, you do see Japan modernize itself more quickly than China and have better outcomes. But Western countries were not very happy about Japan's modernization or its growth in military power. And so after the Boxer Rebellion, the Western powers are like, what is this Japanese power rising, and how are we going to contain them? And so you actually see, so even though Japan was primarily focused on China and Korea, remember the Western powers also have some interests like in Indochina. And so there was ongoing regional volatility, and sometimes the Europeans would support China over Japan, and so Japan would actually pull back. Even though, as I mentioned, it defeated China, it defeated Russia, and so it wasn't necessarily welcome. Now, that said, Japan does change, and it talks about enlightened rule. We see the growth of industrialization. We also see the growth of the places that it controls. So again, if you look at a map of Japan on slide 93, you'll see that they occupy Taiwan or Formosa, they occupy Korea, and later in 1929, they're actually going to create a country that they are going to call Manchukuo in northeast China. So remember, China is going through a lot of turmoil. The Qing Empire collapses in 1911, and so the last emperor is 3 years old. His name was Henry Puyi. So the Japanese will actually take the Chinese emperor and set up a new country that they'll call Manchukuo. But it's really their own country. They settled a whole bunch of Japanese there. And then they're going to make him the emperor. So it's really a puppet state. But the important thing is that Japan is growing, it's exerting itself regionally and on the global stage. It's behaving like one of those great powers. In fact, the Japanese in 1915, during the First World War, will invade China, And then they are going to come up with what are called the 21 demands. The Chinese call this the day of humiliation. But so from about 1860 to about 1900, we see the formation of what we call the Meiji state adaptation. So sort of mixing the Confucian values, so loyalty, filiality, chastity, obedience, and harmony. But these are actually applied to government. So Japanese are encouraged to stop the demonstrations, to shun Christianity, to conform to international public law, but also to stay in Japan, even though Japan was beginning to send out people out of the country. In fact, there's a very interesting mission that was sent around the world that included like a few hundred officials. Not sure why this is important, but apparently there were also a few girls within that, and everywhere you check, you hear. Yeah. So the Meiji Empire changes some administrative structures as a result of this contact and modernization. So one of the biggest is the replacement of the shogun by the Meiji Emperor. The daimyos are replaced. So daimyos rule the Hans, the feudal estates, and so the daimyos are replaced by governors in these prefectures. But we also see the development of business that brings in new oligarchs. Oligarchs are like super wealthy people but also the samurai are disbanded. The Japanese create a national army. They create compulsory education. They create a government that is run by a prime minister. They begin to have political parties. So kind of like a second-rate Western power. And so this is kind of the Japan that is going into the 1900s. You will probably hear about zaibatsu, which were conglomerates. So think about the major Japanese conglomerates that you might be aware of: Fuji, Toyota, Mitsubishi. So really big corporate entities. But we also see the beginning of building of infrastructure, major roads, ports, towns, but Japan was actually already very highly industrialized. And so we see a development of institutions in a way we did not see in China. But even as they begin businesses, they want these businesses to be in the hands of the Japanese. But again, remember they gave the samurai some money when they disbanded them. So the samurai are creating these new businesses. And within a few hundred years, Japan actually, within a few decades, Japan becomes a really modern country with all the sort of devices of modernity. So you also begin to see increase in mining, coal, iron, all of those kinds of things. I mentioned the major corporations like Mitsubishi. So Mitsubishi, for example, was very instrumental in Japan's Second World War, built one of the best fighters in history. So it's a modernity that China did not achieve. We'll actually see after the war, 1945, the bullet train, for example, comes out of Japan. Lots of trains, private railroads, telegraph, and so on. So in 1889, the Meiji Empire issues another constitution, and this is actually a very interesting. So part of what the Japanese favor is what they call kokutai, or national essence. And so this constitution lasts until the end of the Second World War. Yeah. So I think we are going to stop here. There are just a few things left to say about Japan and the Meiji Empire.